Hi, Sam here again with Mark and Emma, and we'll be discussing tonight. The section will be about the second line of the Creed. So, I believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord. And when I was reading this, I was kind of thinking about it. Something I had in my mind was about maybe 15 to 20 years ago, like when I was in college, there'd be all these debates where there'd be a new atheist person, and then they would go up against and they would debate someone who it'd often be like, well, there'd often be like two new atheists, and then there'd be like one Christian and one Jewish person, or maybe even some person who is like broadly theistic. And there's something where I guess the question of who is Christ, though, is it's a point of departure from certainly the Platonic concept of God, but also it's something that divides the church from, well, other parts of the Abrahamic faith, and even among Christians, it's one of the biggest asked questions. I mean, and it's something that people seem to have all kinds of different theories and ideas about. And I guess I'll just start with the two of you. If I put the question to you, who is Christ? What do you think of when you hear that question?
You want the catechism answer?
Catechism
Right?
answer is
No,
fine.
no. I mean,
Yeah.
still, I'm probably going to get into this, but the God man, and the thing that always comes to my mind is Christ. I still sometimes feel a little bit, I don't know, odd saying Jesus instead of just saying Christ. There,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, no, I don't know how to shake it,
I
but
think it's the other way for me. Like
oh, there you go.
I don't think of him as Christ that often. My default is more just Jesus.
Nicey, that may be the result of growing up with it, and
It
then
could well be.
mine is, I remember talking to my wife at one point, and she said, "Well, you always seem to be afraid," and I'm like, "Well, he's the Lord." I, like,
Hmm.
I have a hard time getting around relationship as my relationship to him as Lord, as opposed to him as anything else, and that in that, that's why I always think of Christ first.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense. I could probably stand to meditate on that a little bit more than I do, but
I mean, I think yours is probably better. To be fair, like you're more familiar, more knowing, have that sort of background in you already, where
mhm.
I don't. And so, because I came at it in that intellectual angle, as the
Yeah,
convert always does,
that would be very different.
yeah. So I
I
don't
can't
have
even like
fundamentals.
conceptualize that really.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what is the answer you would give someone if they were maybe in RCA, or they were thinking about that? I mean, that's something you teach, so I mean, I'm sure it's something that's discussed sometimes, and I mean, I don't know if the people you deal with, if they're Christians who are becoming Catholic, or if they're people who don't have backgrounds in faith, or where they're coming
So
from that question.
the first time I taught RCIA, I taught several parts of it. I didn't teach Christology or like, any of that. But this time I have been, because there's only one guy and he's a Muslim converting to Catholicism. And I definitely do bring my own biases there. Like I said, he's the God man, and try to make sure that you understand what that means. I went through a whole thing of like, the basic, who is Jesus? What does this mean? Um, so I definitely come at it almost like from a myth. I don't want to say mythological angle, but do you know what I mean? Like we're in this text, it does come. I'm more heavy on the Christ, like as opposed to the historical Jesus. That's, I think, one of the things that I put in my biases, and I'm not sure it's a good thing, but I do know that that's where I am, and that's how I can teach it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that Ratzinger seems very heavy on is the idea that in the creed it's Jesus Christ, and that those are not necessarily well, in Christianity they are the same thing, but they they are different aspects of um, Jesus. So you have sort of the historical, and then you also have the logos, the sort of spiritual side of it too. I think as he put it at a few points here, you have being in action, or physicality and logos is one thing I put down in my notes.
Yeah, coming at it from the intellectual angle, that's definitely where I started. Like the logos. Okay, so he's reason incarnate. Okay, that's interesting. But and then just get into what Ratzinger says. The man and the office are inseparable. They are the same thing. Where in other places you can take one out of the other and still, like, for example, the office will still exist or the man will still exist. But in this case, they are synonymous. And it's become so synonymous that his last name doesn't exist anymore as far as anybody's concerned because it's unimportant. Right? He is Jesus Christ. Like, end of story. You'd think we want to preserve that.
It's interesting that a lot of the like cutesy, maybe cutesy is the wrong word, that's a little strong, but like the various Bible TV shows will often name themselves like Jesus of Nazareth type, sort of taking a step back from that and focusing more on the person.
Yeah, I mean, it's got it. I mean, I was reading a Bible story to my kid this evening, feeding of the 5,000. It doesn't say Jesus Christ. It says Jesus said. Jesus said. Jesus said this, right? I don't think the word Christ even appears in almost any of these Bible stories. I don't know if it's just even the mention of it feels weightier. I don't know if a child would feel that. Probably not, but maybe.
Or maybe it's just like a strange enough word that they're like.
That's possible.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the thoughts that I had when I was reading over the passage is, I mean, if you're someone who's in first century Judea and you're trying to explain who this teacher is to maybe someone who isn't fully on board or is hearing about Christ for the first time, I do wonder if there is a way in which Jesus Christ might have sounded to the ear of someone in that culture. I mean, because Jesus was a fairly common first name, is my understanding. So, I mean, I wonder if it almost sounds a little bit like Bruce Almighty sounds like to a modern person, where it almost, in a way, it almost could feel like almost like a contradiction of phrase, right? So, I mean, it's something Ratzinger gets at. It's the unity of, the being and the flesh, or the logos and I'll crucify, I guess, another Latin word here, the Starks.
Yeah, that I had to look that one up.
Yeah. So.
I was like, what is that?
Yeah. So yeah, you have the phrase, and yeah, I guess one of the things he talked about too, and I was I was thinking that maybe we'd get to this a little bit later in the discussion, but I guess now is as good a time as any, is the idea that Christ or Messiah, those weren't necessarily phrases that Jesus had used to describe himself. So at least where the term Christus, where it comes from, at least in part, is from the sign that was on the cross, right? So there's this this kind of irony of the idea of the king or the Messiah as being someone who is crucified or someone who is executed.
It's definitely more title that others gave him, right? He was the son. Like
yes,
that's the way he referred to himself.
Mm-hmm.
Others would say, "You are the Christ, you are the Messiah," and he said, "I am the one." Maybe it is us reaching out to him, right? And him definitely accepting that sort of that title and that office. But I mean, I guess the triune God, it would be something lesser in some way than the Son.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think of, Emma, when you hear the
Mhm.
term son? I mean, we talked about the term God-man a little bit, but I guess Ratzinger, though, when he talks about that term, he seems to think that the son is something that's, I mean, it's connected to the idea of being and logos and God, but it's not exactly the same as the Greek term God.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really him just sort of putting to rest a very common argument in the academy. I think especially a little while ago.
Do you want to
The
explicate
idea
that?
The idea that the only reason that they use like Son of God in the Gospels is to make this Hellenistic connection.
Oh yes, I do.
Which is often used to like discount the whole thing of Jesus being the Son of God, and obviously is built on a foundation of like discounting the Gospels as inspired. But so I've come across this argument before. I thought that the tracing the evolution of how it actually does exist in the Hebrew was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that part.
Is that going back partially to the demythologization he goes through with the Oriental kingship?
Yes. That's the part where he talks about that. But he makes a good point that in like Greek and Roman mythology, a son of the god was always primarily human, not primarily divine.
Yeah, they almost like really focus on that human element,
difference.
right? Like they focus in on the weakness of Hercules or something like that, which clearly has the same problems as humans.
Well, and all the heroes die.
Yeah, that's also true. And they ain't coming back either.
All the heroes like die horribly. The Greek myths do not usually have happy endings.
No, that's why they're called tragedies. Man. But you got my noggin jogging here, and you're talking about how they aren't fully human. Sorry, they aren't fully divine, but even the gods themselves aren't fully divine, right? They have human foibles. They're just amplified.
Yeah,
right?
They're very much just ramped up.
Where in this case, it's something so completely different that the one who is completely other becomes like us while being a perfect form of us, and it makes him feel alien in that same way. Like a human without flaw feels odd.
It does. And that's why also it makes more sense that it's not like a haphazard combination of Greek and Hebrew mythology, because how would that even work? They're on such completely different levels.
Yeah, if Jesus was, an angry son of God that came down to smite the sinners and got off the cross and killed everybody, yeah, sure, that'd be a mix of Greek and Hebrew. I could see that. But that's not what happened.
No.
No, completely not. Definitely did not follow any of those Hey, those scripts.
So the idea of, I don't know if there's a good answer to this question, but it's definitely one that I had in my mind, even though it's not explicitly in the text really that much, is the idea of God in a form that where he experiences limitations. Is that a contradiction? And I know this is a pretty weighty theology thing. And if not, I mean, why not? I mean, is it a contradiction to say God was man in the sense that God experienced the things that people experience, like hunger and pain, and I mean, having some sort of disappointment or limitation?
Oh, please, hopefully the Thomas don't watch any of my answers here. Because it's gonna be like you're searching through your mind. Okay, what heresy am I gonna say right now?
No wrong answers. Only wrong answers.
I mean,
Only
what's a textbook answer, Emma? It's supposed to be, the human nature was added to the divine nature, therefore nothing was changed in God.
Yeah, something like that. It's
Um,
been a long time since I did much Thomistic theology at all. But
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to struggle here because I'm like I just don't want to answer wrong.
Well, I guess maybe at a more practical level, like you're dealing with a convert who he grew up in a Muslim faith background, and I mean that might be something that that might be a question that he has, right? And it is certainly one that comes up. It's sort of a repeating theme in a lot of Christology and also in discussions between faiths and even among Christians. So I guess what would you tell him, I guess, or how would you
Yeah.
maybe put it that way if he had brought up some of those questions?
I think what it would be for me is I tried to say something like, it's not a contradiction. God may choose to restrain himself as he sees fit. Kind of like you do with a child. The child can do things to you and you'll not, use your full strength in some ways. He's here for a mission, and that mission requires that he put aside that great power. And in that, there's great strength, and he shows us how to use that, right? Like submitting to the cross willingly, that he's the lamb who doesn't make a sound when he goes to the shearer. That sort of thing is probably what I would try to emphasize. I don't know about you, Emma.
I don't know. I don't really have any experience teaching any sort of like RCIA classes, so I've never really thought about it that much, I guess.
I guess your parish doesn't need someone desperately.
Not that I've heard.
That's the only reason I'm here.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, good for you.
It's a hard question, though, right? Like,
it is.
I mean, if you want to tie this in a bit to what Ratzinger talks about, like, this isn't Ratzinger, this is someone else. When you look at the early church, basically all the fights were about Christology, right? All the heresies are Christological heresies, and that's what the focus of things are on. Where today, I was listening to some podcast of some guy who converted and said, you know what, what my girlfriend's parents said when I asked to marry them, how are we justified? As if that was the most important question possible for Christianity. And it's like, no one thought about that, really. It was all Christological fights. Like, am I wrong about that? Like not all of them, right? But a giant majority of them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, Ratzinger definitely does identify the difference between Christology and, oh gosh, I always butcher the other word, but soteriology?
Soteriology?
Soteriology, yes. Gosh, okay. Well, anyways, he identifies the difference between those two as being something that began sort of in the late Middle Ages. So, and he identifies Anselm as someone who had kind of thought of the two as being something different. So, I mean, there is, yeah, definitely this idea of, well, who is God, and, well, who by extension is Christ. And yeah, I guess something I had in my mind, and I guess I would like to think that this was an original thought of mine, but it sort of actually comes from a song. The song is Nothing is Beyond You, but what it references is the 139th Psalm, which is about, so the Psalm is about the omnipotence of God, but it ties the omnipotence of God to the idea of God as being personal, um, gosh, being someone who sees the person in their, well, in their innermost parts, right? To use uh, the phrase of the psalm there, and yeah, I guess I'd like to say it was my thought that the way that that connected to the gospel in the New Testament, but I do think there's something there that the omnipotence of God doesn't only mean um, that God can do things that are that we think of as miraculous, but it also means that God can put on and adapt and have limitations in a way that we don't quite, well, he can have what appears to be limitations in a way that we can't quite understand either.
Yeah, I mean, right? Think about this. I mean, we'd say superhuman strength to restrain yourself when I'm sure like all the Christ had no temptation to sin, but you know, the human instinct to survive would be crying out to live
Mm-hmm.
and submitting, right? Like, may this cup pass from me, Father. That sort of thing. It's
I mean, he did wrestle with it in the garden. Like
yeah,
it wasn't
Yeah.
an easy
yeah.
thing.
That's what I mean. It's that in itself is one of those. It's like, well, think about it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I guess I definitely think of the temptations in the desert too. And I think of, even though it's, as far as I know, not really talked about an introduction to Christianity, it was one of the more memorable parts of Jesus of Nazareth, Part One, where Ratzinger writes about the temptations and the idea of, well, I mean, the question is, who is Christ or what is his mission? I mean, and there's presented a number of false choices. I mean, one is sort of a purely humanitarian or to provide bread, as it were. And then another one is the political. And then there's also the idea of Christ as just sort of a Gnostic figure who's kind of, he are I don't know, sort of like a magician almost. And I mean, the idea is that Jesus sort of rejects all three of those to some extent, even though he also, I mean, part of what his mission was contained in part of that. I mean, it is a thing when you think of, yeah, heresy, and part of what gives it its power in a way is that it contains an element of truth within it, even though it's sort of an unbalanced version of the truth, if you will, a lot of the time.
That's a good way to put it. It's unbalanced. There's something not quite right. And of course, proper theology is built on a graveyard of heresies,
Mm-hmm.
or at least that's what we believe. And me and Emma. I don't know about it outside the church in that way. But you bring up the temptations. Actually, Fulton Sheen does a really good job in his Life of Christ on talking about that.
Oh.
And the one, when you brought up the bread, the one that always comes to my mind is said, Christ is not a bread king. He is the King of Kings, right? And then at the end there, you talk about him being a Gnostic, and that does get back to something Ratzinger talks about, which I definitely haven't seen in my life because I was not part of it, but maybe you guys did growing up Christians. The idea to denude Jesus, basically, to make him just a nice teacher on a hill, right? He's just a hippie trying to make everybody love each other. Like, did you guys experience that growing up?
So I think that's maybe something that's maybe a little bit more from what I understand in the academy, kind of, to some extent. I mean, they talk about Boltman and a few other scholars, and I guess the idea of Jesus as being someone who, I don't know, the zealous teacher, or but not someone who, not being born of a virgin or being in some way closer connected to God necessarily. I mean, that's not something I really necessarily think I ever heard from any Christians I know.
Honestly, I think it's something you're much more likely to encounter if you like study philosophy or something than if you're actually like Christian. Maybe some churches will like downplay the divine aspect of him, but only by so much.
Okay, because I could say coming from the outside, that's definitely I think a lot of the view that people outside the faith have is that Christ aspect, the incarnation, isn't really understood, but transmitted, right? Like Jesus is just a super person, right? That's all it is.
Yeah. There are definitely some, I think, like mainline churches that don't emphasize it a lot, but wouldn't like deny it if you asked.
Well, I think where the denuding of the gospel or the supernatural elements of it probably comes from, in my experience with people who consider themselves believers, isn't so much in a denial as much as it is in the idea of the gospel is sort of like a consumer good, and Jesus is being like the smartest man who ever lived, which, I mean, like I was saying before, I mean, heresies always have an element of the truth to them. And I mean, yes, the Bible has wisdom, and yes, there's wisdom in the teachings of Christ. But at the same time, if you're looking at it as, I don't know, a way to health and wellness, that's not, it's certainly not what the disciples found, right? And it's
Jesus is
what
guru.
Christ found either. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Your best life now, right?
Yeah, literally. That does seem to be a lot of it, right? Just treating him as like the Buddha, right? I mean, that's really where we part ways from all of that, is the claim that no, it's way more than that. It's way more important than that. And that's, I mean, isn't that where C.S. Lewis, I think C.S. Lewis talks about, that's one of the main distinguishing factors that makes Christianity so much different, is our founder claimed to be God, right? Not a prophet of God, not the prophet of God, or a prophet, just God. That's pretty crazy.
I mean, that's where the Lord Liar Lunatic thing comes from.
Yeah. So that's definitely something Ratzinger talks about. And I guess, well, he talks about Boltman and the idea of Christ as just sort of being like a wisdom teacher. But then he circles back, and I mean, if you think I'm off of this, either one of you jump in, because it wasn't there quite explicitly in the text. But so my thought is, so you're reading the creed, right? And the exact line is, I believe in Jesus Christ, his only son, our Lord, right? So the term Christ, as I understand it, and as I read it in the text, was connected to the cross and the resurrection. So when so the creed itself, the logic of it is showing that part of the most important thing that Jesus did was offer himself as a sacrifice, right? And then, as he says in the end of the passage, that out of his side there's the blood and the water, which is the symbol of the sacraments. And so with that, though, if you say, so the logic of it seems to imply that what he did was the most important thing, right? And so if you say, well, he was just a wisdom teacher, then I think there's a question which, should probably challenge people who do think of it that way is, well, then what does the cross mean? So, the way Ratzinger words it is, but is an empty then any easier to swallow than one filled with content? So, if he's just someone who died and the followers of Christ, they were mistaken about what the death had meant, what does that mean exactly? That's as, I don't know, almost as troubling of a thought as anything you could say about any claims you can make about what they believed in terms of the resurrection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had something in my head here. It's definitely, I think people outside don't really get the cross, and they don't really, they see it, right? Like they see things like this all the time without really thinking about what that means and what it means if it wasn't what we claim it is, which is, his coronation, as opposed to just someone like Socrates who died by drinking hemlock. Is there any difference then? If Socrates had just woken up again and been like, hey, I'm good to go. But without any of the back logic of sacrifice, of doing this freely of his own accord, I don't know what it would mean in that case.
It would definitely mean something, but it would change things. But I don't know what it would mean either.
Would we still have the crucifix at the center of so many churches if it wasn't like the pivotal event? Like, as he says, the axial point.
Well, I don't think this is entirely a theoretical question, right? Because there are branches of, whether you want to call them Christians or not, I don't know, religious traditions where they have de-emphasized the cross and the sacrifice of Christ. And crosses are not anywhere near as present there. You see it both. I know people probably were thinking maybe of Mormons when I said that, but you could also talk about certain types of, not the conservative Unitarians are so common in the Discord, but the liberal Unitarians, right?
No, that's, go get a little banter. Like, you're basically just making Muslim Jesus at that point, right? Like, I don't know, because for me, the crucifix is such an important thing and powerful symbol to me. Like, when I'm in mass, I'm kind of staring at it almost the entire time if it's there. I probably should have my eyes on the tabernacle, but if it's a good crucifix, it's usually over the tabernacle.
I think either makes sense, and it's just which you're drawn to in a particular moment, really.
I hope so. it's just the faith doesn't feel real without that portion. I mean, even the empty cross to me is very denuded. Again,
Yeah.
I think if you were to do it properly, it would be almost like a Byzantine way, which would be you emphasize Christ the King as a different point as opposed to having the crucifix everywhere, which is, I think, a very Latin thing to do.
I think it is a very Latin thing to do.
I think that would be the way I would go as opposed to anywhere else. But that doesn't seem to be where these branches go, right? They're not emphasizing Christ the King. It's, I don't even know what the heck they emphasize. Like, to be fair, I know very little of what Mormons believe, and it ain't good. And I give Sam a pass on whatever he's doing.
Well, no, I mean, I think in terms of the sort of Christology, it's Christ as the wisdom teacher, right? I mean, that's sort of it seems like that's sort of the angle that a lot of Muslim and even probably Hindu scholars look at it too, right? So, but yeah, I guess. Well, for Ratzinger, though, that's very insufficient, though. He doesn't seem to think very much of that idea, though, right? I mean, it's he seems to think that this is what early Christians believed, and this is why, and he kind of goes over it. But I don't know. I guess it is something, though, where, I mean, it's in the New Testament, right? It's in the creeds. This was something, though, that was very disputed, though, right, over time, and yeah.
What was disputed?
Who Christ is, right?
Yeah, I mean, when we think of him as a wisdom teacher, right? If that was so true, then why do all the creeds focus on who Christ is, right? He is his teaching, and his teaching is him, right? I don't remember the gospel actually being mentioned in the creed that I recite every single Sunday, right? It's who is God, what did he do, and what are we looking forward to? Also, the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. They shoved that in there too.
Well, I can't imagine a faith mostly based around just wisdom teaching. Like, Christ's sacrifice is so important to the sacraments, and him being God is so important to the sacraments. And without the sacraments, Catholicism is empty.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, like 40K emperor worship. I mean, that's really what it would be, right? It's just fancy looking. Might as well go become a liberal Anglican at that point. I just have the pretty. I mean, to be fair, they probably do better liturgies most of the time.
A lot of the time.
A lot of the time.
Objectively better music, as I've heard.
Yeah.
It described.
Definitely. This also comes to what he says that, the Father is the uniting figure a lot of the time, and the Son is what divides us. So people who want unity try to denude the Son by finding angles where he's not divisive. But even in those angles, like wisdom teacher, go read what he said. You tell me if that's divisive or not. Like, no divorce. That's pretty divisive, right? A whole bunch of his teachings, super divisive. They're not just everybody love each other. I think that's so surface level, and it gets played over too many times, and it's almost weaponized against the whole faith in general. I hate to say it that way, but it does feel to me that whenever you're talking about something that's divisive, they say, "Oh, but didn't he say this?" Yeah, he did, but come on. What about the rest of it? Not all who say "Lord, Lord" will enter the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
Spicy mood.
Yeah. Did either one of you have thoughts about the passages about sonship? So there were two fairly long.
Oh, those were so complicated. Oh my gosh. I don't know about you, Emma, but I was reading
Which part?
What?
Well, there's two sections really. So he talks about the Son of God, which he connects that to Psalm 2. And he also talks about the Son, which he links to the idea of, well, Christ's prayer or prayers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I did like the connection to the psalm. I thought that was so. It's definitely been done before, and maybe I've heard it before, but the idea that the kings of Israel saying that they will bend is like, what a joke of you. And then it's a prefigurement of this universal kingship that they all will bend the knee.
Yeah. Yeah, something I thought about with that is that so there's also a phrase, the Davidic kingship, which is sort of interesting because in Samuel, David was not anointed and became king at the same time. I mean, he was anointed, and I mean, I don't know how long it was exactly, but it was several years, and he was during that time persecuted quite intensely at one point. And I mean, you connect that to Israel, and then you also connect that to Christ too. And it's like that's yeah, no, I definitely near the end of the passage today, I was kind of like, I had the idea of like Pajot and symbolism kind of in my head, and I was thinking of that, and also the way that Ratzinger connects Adam and Christ too, and the idea of the side, or I guess as people often misinterpret it, the rib. So
yeah, I I actually read that, and I definitely made a note of it. The pierced side of Christ being the full opening of the sun, being purely for the mirror of creation of woman itself. And
I mean, I'm pretty sure that moment has been described as the creation of the church at least once.
Okay, that's a good way to put it, right? The church coming out of the life of the last man.
Because it's like water flowing from the side of the temple.
Oh, that's really good. That's good. See, I didn't make that connection either.
I forget where I heard it, but yeah, it was a sacraments class somewhere at some point.
It's a good catechesis class as opposed to what I give. So,
I'm sure yours are also good.
We'll see. We'll see. I have to ask Father Amica at the end. Been like, here's what I've said. Please either approve or disapprove. Can we splash water on him now? But I think I definitely misunderstood. I don't know if I misunderstood Ratzinger somewhere, but I liked his connection of the pure being for, and then connecting it to God as actuality, and that
I liked that too.
Christ's life lived out is pure actuality, pure act. Which I was like, whoa, that's a good connection. The God of philosophy and the God of the Bible coming together at the same time.
And then coming into history as man.
Yeah, just doing what has to be done. I know this is going to be a huge sidebar. Coming back to something you said earlier about Anselm. Anselm? You know him. Anselm? Yeah. It's funny that I actually came up with a paraphrase of that idea when I was trying to figure out what was going on with the crucifixion. I'm like, oh, infinite debt has to have an infinite payment, and there's only one infinite payment. So I get where it comes from. It makes logical sense, right? But it's definitely what's the word I'm looking for?
Do we have something going on in the background here?
I don't.
I know that's just me.
It's not me. For once.
I don't think it's me.
For once, it's not me. But the idea that any one thing can capture the cross and the the process that went on, I think is so foolish. Right? There's just too much going on, and it's a wise, definitely divine decision that the church has never spoken on what's these ones you have to believe. Right? They all have some form of it. And I think some of the scorn that gets poured out on that version that Anselm came up with and has been, I guess, later refined, or I don't know if you use the word refined, Emma, or changed into penal substitutionary atonement, right? There's definitely language that supports it.
There is. I have a very difficult time understanding penal substitutionary atonement.
I don't understand it fully.
I'll be honest. I just don't get it. But I know that's been a big thing for my husband in converting to Catholicism and unpicking like previous thought patterns, because he came from a Reformed influenced non-denominational background. So it was sort of the background assumption of everything.
Yeah, I don't get it fully. I just know it was related to Anselm's idea, right? So that's the version that I have in my mind, is what he said, which I know is different, but it's kind of like the antecedent idea.
Yeah, I know it's different. I don't get how.
Yeah, maybe Sam knows better than I do. Probably does.
Well, I mean, the idea of, the cross is sort of a judgment, and Christ is a second Adam being judged, and then, the sacrifice being the redemption. It seemed to me like, for what I know it's a controversial thing, but it seemed to me like what he spells out from Anselm.
Yeah, we're gonna butcher this.
Okay, yeah. That seemed to be, fairly basic Christian teaching, but I know, obviously, it's not without its detractors. Both.
I think also the biggest thing, as far as I understand, with like the substitution part, is that it's not just this like initial substitution at the cross. It's each person's particular judgment. If you are a Christian, basically God judges you as Jesus. Like Jesus stands in front of you and he sees Jesus instead of you. Is how I've always heard that part described. Yeah. And that's when I was like, whoa.
Yeah. I won't put too much in it, but it was definitely a funny thing when I read it. I'm like, oh, I remember thinking this. So I'm not crazy. I just know it's a controversial topic, and a lot of people in this little corner, as they say, seem to have a deep scarring from it, which is curious from where I sit. I find a lot of that whole conversation curious. Not growing up with any of it, I find it mostly just intellectually interesting, as opposed to there's no baggage.
Well, the funny thing is I didn't grow up with it at all either, because Catholicism conceptualizes it very differently most of the time. So it wasn't until I started talking to Protestants and trying to figure out what they believed that it even entered my radar.
Yeah, it's a complete sidebar. So sorry about that, Sam. I just wanted to get back to it.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I think it's something where, I guess to go off a little more on that rabbit hole. I think a lot of times when people do deconvert, or when they deconstruct their faith, it is because it's not because they necessarily came up with an argument. It's because they found someone that they didn't trust, or a community that they didn't trust. And then they sort of work the arguments backwards. And the same thing I think happens when a lot of times when people feel supported by a faith community too, right? Faith is something that is received, right?
It's spoken out.
Yes, exactly. Any other thoughts at all from the passages there?
Let me just go through my notes quickly. I mean, I think he definitely goes back to this idea of Christian positivism in a way, in that somehow Christianity has to merge the positivist aspect of it, that it happened in a point in history, with the non-positivist kind of metaphysics,
Yeah.
which is such a, to me, that is one of the things that drew me further and further in, was that kind of marriage, in that we're pointing to something specific, but that has eternal implications.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I like the way that he had put it when he quoted oh the gosh I guess we're just gonna keep butchering names today, but Chardin. So the
I can't help
universal
it.
energy must be a thinking energy. If it is not to be less highly evolved than the ends animated by its actions. So,
Mhm.
I mean, as I understand it, the concept is that if something is more complex, or something, in this case, maybe if it is more human, then I mean, it has to, in some way, I guess, you can't say that it's less, I guess, evolved or less thinking than what comes out of it. So, in that sense, yeah, I mean, there is the unity of, well, the logos and um, the the physical, if you will, or so, or being in action, as yeah, as Ratzinger puts it in parts.
Yeah. I liked his little discussion of how introducing scientific principles to history limits it in a way that it maybe shouldn't always be limited. It takes too much away from history. And here you can think about like ancient historians who are willing to include just any story that seems interesting. Like if you read Herodotus, he's got like flying snakes and giant ants that have like hordes of gold and all kinds of stuff. Because it all seemed worthwhile to him. But now it seems totally laughable because you can't scientifically verify any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And if you
We
can't
presume they're
scientifically
false.
verify it, it doesn't, right, you presume it's false. It doesn't belong in a history.
That's how I used to read. Because I was, I guess, not taught, but like subconsciously, when you'd read someone like a saint or something in like an ethics class, and you kind of just filter out any mention of God, any mention of the supernatural. You just filtered that out. I'm like, oh yes, this is what they believed. It's all bullcrap.
That's so sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's very deracinated, right? It's very hollow way to read it, but that's definitely kind of the way you're encouraged to do it. I don't even know if you're encouraged. Maybe that's too strong a word, but you're not discouraged from doing so.
Well, it's just assumed that, of course, that's how you do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't even reach the point of encouragement. It doesn't have to.
Yeah, it's definitely the normative. If you're in a secular university or something like that. I mean, I know one thing that came up, which was weird, was the Treaty of Tordesillas between Portugal and Spain and the papacy, and it was never brought up. Another was like, how did the Pope think he had jurisdiction over this? It was like, I at that time I was like, yeah, no, sounds fair to me. But coming back to it now, I'm like, well, you didn't really think about that too hard, did you? You didn't think about why he might think he might have that.
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff is just completely assumed away.
Well, I mean, here's, I guess, an interesting question. I'm a little bit surprised we haven't touched on it, at least explicitly, with 5 videos in here. I mean, is Ratzinger a mystic? Or does he have a mystical understanding of faith?
Goes back to what do you think is a mystic? I'm not sure. I mean, it sounds mystical to me. I mean, if I have read read. I listened to Jesus of Nazareth, part 1, and that's certainly mystic as hell, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you're just reading Introduction to Christianity, I think it is maybe an open question a little bit. But if you get into Jesus of Nazareth, and then some of his papal and papal emeritus writings, I guess. I mean, there's definitely a mystical element to it, and he definitely does. Well, he talks about positivism, right, and the historical method, and I'm trying to think, he uses the phrase. Oh gosh, I want to make sure I get it right here, but I had it highlighted here. So, but it's like the poverty of thought or something along those lines to describe positivism. And it's like, so I guess in that sense, like, but I mean, he is a serious academic though too at the same time. So I mean, there's a reason I ask the question, right? Because I mean, I don't know if you had a first century like if you had like maybe say like a third century monk read Ratzinger's work, I don't know if they'd say, oh, this is the work of a mystic. I mean, they might think of it in a very different way than we would. But I mean, I guess like a lot of writers there's that capture people's mind. There's what you might consider contradictions or at least paradoxes in their writing.
Here's a thought that comes up talking about that. Jordan Peterson's lectures captured a lot of people. What if one of those people who had listened to him for the first time had walked into Ratzinger while he was giving this lecture and walked into the hall? Do you think they would have found the same thing in it?
I think you're asking the wrong person here, maybe.
I feel like probably not quite.
Yeah, I do think Peterson's probably a little more intelligible to someone who doesn't have a theological background, I would think.
I think Ratzinger is more talking to people who already know something about religion. But this is actually very important to me as someone who does like academic research sometimes on theology. I think it's very dangerous if you separate the mystic and the academic. I think everybody should be a little bit of both.
How do you think you marry that?
Lean more one way. Well, that's the question, isn't it? Some people will lean more one way or the other, but you should never, like, no one should only have one. For me personally, I think a lot of time in adoration helps.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note to maybe start winding down with, because I mean, it's Jesus Christ, right? And I mean, on one hand, if you take it the second part out, if you have only Jesus, it's a historical or the positivistic, and if you have only Christ, it's the Gnostic, or to some extent, ultimately the meaningless. And I mean, the creed, and Christianity more broadly in the Gospels, I mean, unites the two. Right? Yep. So.
But you think about like Thomas Aquinas, especially. He's a really good example of this because he's
unfairly maligned.
He's known for like the Summa and all his academic writing, but he levitated.
Fact.
That's in there too, and he wrote some of the most widely used hymns to the Eucharist. And he had like visions of Christ and stuff.
Yeah.
Don't we? I swear there's a chant that you could do a Corpus Christi from Aquinas.
Oh, probably.
Because I know
most of our Eucharistic chants are from Thomas Aquinas. Like
Yeah.
Tantamergo. The translation is Godhead here in hiding. I don't remember the Latin off the top of my head right now. Yeah, a lot of them come from Aquinas.
So you heard it here, folks. Be more like Aquinas.
You need to
Be more
unite
mystical.
the mystic
Be more
and
mystical.
the academic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was thinking about sort of the question at the beginning of that I asked at the beginning of the video, and part of me thought, well, I probably couldn't do a better job answering it than Ratzinger does, and at some level, I think it's sort of foolish to even try. But with that, I mean, I was thinking I wanted to end today with the part where he talks about the pure side of Christ.
Roll it.
So, all right.
Yeah.
For John, the picture of the pure side forms the climax not only of the crucifixion scene, but of the whole story of Jesus. Now, after the piercing with the spear that ends his earthly life, his existence is completely open. Now he is entirely for. Now he is truly no longer a single individual, but Adam, from whose side Eve, a new mankind, is formed. The profound description in the Old Testament, according to which the woman is taken from the side of the man, an intimidable expression of their perpetual dependence on each other and their unity in the one humanity. The story seems to be echoed here in the reoccurrence of the word side. The open side of the new Adam repeats the mystery of the open side of man at creation. It is the beginning of a new definitive community of men with one another, a community symbolized here by blood and water, in which John points to the basic Christian sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, and through them to the church as a sign of the new community of men. A fully open Christ who completes the transformation of being into reception and transmission is less visible as what at the deepest level he always was, as Son. So Jesus on the cross has truly entered on his hour, as once again John says. The enigmatic mode of speech may perhaps become, to some extent, comprehensible. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for being here tonight. Yeah.
Thank you.
God bless.